Let's go. I mean, sounded like you were ready to start going. So, metal, what the fuck's going on with it?
Um, yeah, sure. So my basic pitch is I'm trying to uncover the ideology that's in metal. I think that metal is more than a subculture at this point. It's been around now for more than 50 years, and in that time, it's cohered to a worldview in a way that a lot of other subcultures have struggled to do so. Um, and we've had metal studies as an academic field for the past kind of 30 years or so now, with sociologists and cultural anthropologists sort of taking stock over what metal is and how it seems to function. But what we're ultimately left with in a lot of cases are analyses that can define the symptoms of what metal is. Like we can go to a gig and we can see the way that people interact with each other. We can look at conversations. We can talk to people about their experiences, but pointing to an underlying worldview or something that pins this all together, that project is still relatively untouched.
What is this worldview, if you could summarize it in a few
points? My basic stance is that metal is an existentialist response to late capitalism that arises in a hedonistic / creative response. That's the most kind of mechanical way we can look at it. And obviously we should probably delve a little further into what exactly we mean when we're talking about this. But yeah, so my basic point is to try and uncover, yes, this metal ideology, and from that we can start to paint a picture of what we might term a metal subject.
An interesting place to start with that is thinking about it as this response to late capitalism, beginning in, I mean, it's hard to draw definite points, right? But it's generally agreed that Black Sabbath started something that wasn't going on quite before them. And that was late 60s. Tony Iommi was a metal worker in Birmingham, which is quite well reputed to be a shithole even now.
Right. So this is very interesting. In fact, I wrote a paper about the kind of mythos that surrounds Birmingham as a city, as a metal city, because there are a lot of things about this that are very appealing. I think this is something I'll want to return to later. But the way that metal responds to late capitalism, I think, is primarily driven by this utter revulsion towards industrialized society. You can see that all over like the corpus of metal artists' work, like everything from Sabbath, where they're on War Pigs, for instance, on their second album Paranoid, they're talking about the vagaries of the military industrial complex as it's ravaging Vietnam. And this is like in 1971, sorry, not even then, 1970. And then you can trace it all the way through Metallica and basically the whole of thrash metal, all of death metal. There's a consistent critique of society that's happening there. What's interesting to me as well is that metal, while it appears to be somewhat politically bifurcated, as we've got some portions of metal that are known for being very, very right-wing. In fact, so there's National Socialist black metal is its own subgenre. But the majority, I would say, in my opinion, to my knowledge, through my experience, I have not done the demographics yet. To my knowledge, most people in metal tend to fall to the left. But what I think unites both sides is a radical desire for wide systemic change, not just new programs, but a transcendence of the current form. I think is the thing that underpins it all. Whatever your position in whichever socioeconomic circumstance you end up in, or you're positioned in, if you're into metal, it's a firm rejection of those normative values that you're surrounded by, and a desire to kind of see some upheaval. and massive change.
And do you think that metal is something that exists in opposition and in relation to late industrial capitalist societies? Or do you reckon that it is also held together by perhaps something deeper, more diffuse, more transcendental?
See, I think there is something there's something deeper to it, but it can't ever be extricated away from late capitalism, because those are the conditions that it's incubated in. And these are the material processes as well that it has to engage with. You have to go to a studio, you have to pay them money, you have to make the money potentially. You have to have money to buy the equipment at the very least.
Very good point.
We're always going to be tied up in these processes, but I think the desire for transcendence and the desire for something deeper, that in itself is one of the defining characteristics of metal, is a yearning for transcendence. I say it's the being able to survey your current circumstances, being able to survey the world, whichever country you live in, however you fall in the socioeconomic ladder, and being able to look outside and think, this is absolutely disgusting, and that's going to motivate me to perform, to engage in this performative turning away from normative values. And attempt to develop one's own culture that's kind of discrete from normative culture, and in fact completely counterposed. But as I say again, metal is still positioned in opposition to hegemony. Without hegemony, we may find ourselves in an odd position as metal artists. What would happen if we had nothing to critique? What if we had nothing to complain about?
So there's something here that, and I'd be interested to hear what you think on this, because my sense is that metal is very powerful as a critique, as a negation, but it doesn't seem to get beyond just positing itself as a kind of bubble of otherness. And when I'm thinking, there's a great actual blog online that I've referenced in the podcast before by a guy called David Chapman, where he traces the history of subcultures. And he's talking about the initial first wave of subcultures, which was, broadly speaking, kind of hippieism on the left, and then evangelical Christianity on the right in the States. Both had a strong universalist tendency in them. What that means, they were both in their own way trying to unite everybody towards one thing, whether it was one love, peace, and chillness, or whether it was God. The next wave of subculture, which we can see in more punk and heavy metal indeed, resolved the failures of the previous generation by giving up on the universalism and saying, we're going to do our own thing, and it's going to give us an identity and a place outside of hegemony, but we're going to be less concerned with actually changing the hegemony as just kind of pointing out the flaws with it and moving ourselves away with it.
Right, that's a very, very interesting point. To that, I would counter, for me, metal. There's a musician called Arthur Brown who was he was a psychedelic musician, but he pioneered a lot of performance techniques that metal musicians use. Like he wore corpse paint, and he had this incredible operatic vocal range, and he screamed. And this was all in the late '60s. When he was asked what he saw himself as, he said, "We're like dark hippies. We're like an inversion of hippies," and that I think is what metal. That I think is what metal kind of represents. It's the acknowledgement of the failures of the psychedelic era to a great extent. By the end of the 60s, Woodstock has evaporated, and literally at the end of 1969, you have Altamont, which is this terrifyingly poorly run concert in which multiple people die because the Hells Angels ran the security, and the whole dream, the whole universalized dream, as you said, that a musical movement could change the world en masse, seemed to disappear. But that was 50 years ago. Metal is now in a point where the culture is entrenched, and in fact, we've developed such systemic critiques that are so detailed in some cases. There are some artists out there who are so adept at identifying the root systemic causes in the world that they live in that we can actually say there are people in metal who have projects. There are people in metal who can foresee a world that is better than the one we live in. But right now, it is ours to describe a litany of horrors that we can see every day. Whether I think this is approaching a realistic project, I think I'm right on the beginning of this of kind of studying whether that's a possibility. My hope is to identify that metal could potentially become a social bloc, effectively, something that's more than a subculture, something where the worldview is actually recognized as binding the fans together in a more substantive way than merely cultural preference.
It's interesting, that binding together of people according to a worldview. We spoke to Benjamin Teitelbaum, and he's also a person who studies black metal, and he mentioned something that to me speaks of the shamanic qualities of metal, and that was he was naming some characteristics, and among them he spoke about the unintelligibility of vocals, which at some moments that does have a shamanic function, and that was kind of the background of my first question. So when I asked, is there something deeper, transcendental in metal? Maybe I'll reframe it. Maybe I'll say, is heavy metal, does it have ancestors, and where do they lie? You mentioned something.
Sure.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of Terence McKenna, and his archaic revival thesis sits very nicely here, I think. Metal draws on what we can call a mythic wellspring, as it were. We've got the entirety of history, the entirety of world myth, all of fiction to choose from in our source material. And what we are able to do is recombine very, very disparate elements. Like a classic example would be Nile, who are a Florida-based band that exclusively write about ancient Egypt. That's all they write about. They are combining disparate elements in a very postmodern way to create new, powerfully meaningful stories or descriptions or evocations that, yes, I would say there's a definite kind of quasi-magical element to metal. This is something I think about all the time. Like when you go to a gig and you see three guys or three people standing on stage with the amps, they are magicians. Basically, they've got the command of massive amounts of electricity. That is magic in its way, especially the ability to change with like a subtle movement of your hands. You can make people feel things. That is, for sure, that is the same as shamanic ritual. Absolutely. Then, yeah, we can go into the vocals as well, because I think. If we want to talk about magic, one of the things we have to talk about is obscurity, because that's all that esotericism actually is. That is what occultness is. It's secrecy, obscurity for its own sake. And in death metal vocals, in black metal vocals, we hear a deliberate obscurity. It's trying to make it harder for you to find that meaning, actually. And in a way that makes the community stronger, because if you have to go and listen to the lyric, if you have to listen to the song and you have to go and read the lyrics afterwards, you have to try and find out what they actually mean, because you didn't quite hear them when you were listening to it first time. That creates a far more meaningful relationship between you and the lyrics than if you have the luxury of being able to hear them as you do in pop songs and potentially mishear them. But you're not going to bother to try and read the lyrics if you think you know what they are. Whereas in metal, the barrier is set. You have to meet them. You have to raise yourself up. You have to perform an extra bit of intellectual labor. And that intellectual labor is meaning. Intellectual labor can very easily be equated to meaning.
And do you think that there's something that metal speaks to in the human soul that other genres of music and subcultures do not?
Yes, I think one of my principal concepts is that metal is deeply existential and primarily concerned with mortality. The death appears in every subgenre of metal without exception, which is remarkable. And I'm talking stuff as light as Bon Jovi or Motley Crue are deeply bound up with the futility of existence, the shortness of life, how easily it can be taken away, which only can result in hedonism for these musicians. That is the only option left, because when life is so short and so fleeting, and the circumstances to which you're born are so dramatically oppressive in so many cases, if you're offered a bottle, just take it. that I think is the practical output of metal, is that we feel about death a lot. Everybody that likes metal thinks about their own death to a greater extent, I think, than people that don't, and that results in this kind of hedonism.
That's very important. That's very important. You know, McKenna himself said that psychedelics are a way to meditate upon death. Or there was probably some philosopher that I don't recall the name. He said the same thing. The philosophy is ultimately meditating upon death, and it feels very interesting that heavy metal focuses specifically on that existential layer, on death as a concept. It hinges upon death, and everyone, the whole theatrics of it feels like a death culture.
Yes,
it's very interesting.
It's Thanatos, completely. The weird way is how many deaths are described, in fact, because like death metal has this kind of surgical glee in painstakingly describing every single characteristic of the way a certain surgical tool could kill you. Or you have doom, which is concerned with the melancholy, the qualia of living in spite of futility. Or you have black metal, which is this kind of screeching absolutism. It's trying to... black metal is where I think death metal gets most philosophical. Black metal is almost metal trying to understand itself in a lot of ways. They're trying to draw out what is heavy, what is kvult. You know, they're the people that are sketching these boundaries for the rest of the metal community to sit inside. Also, they think, because these people are pretentious to no end. I say that as someone I like black metal. Don't get me wrong, but they have a tendency to disappear up their own arses on occasion, and burn churches, and that's not worth condoning.
There's something fascinating to unpack there in the fact that black metal did start burning churches. It's because it's essentially terrorism. It's essentially, what did Dylan?
I agree.
It as he was like, it's. I think he once said that black metal is basically Scandinavian musical ISIS.
I would agree with that. Well, Second Wave to an extent does have some of those qualities for sure. They are, like ISIS, counterposed in total nihilism, because, and this is something that I encountered when I was reading Forget Foucault by Baudrillard a couple of months ago, and there's a section in there where he talks about the aesthetics of fascism, and he completely nails what black metal is in the same paragraph, and he says it's an aesthetics of death. Focus on the word aesthetics of death. We are seeing death performed out for us in fascism. We are seeing a non-past attempting to be brought back to life. We're talking about a mythical past, and a past that is completely defined by the present moment, and they are trying to drag this past kicking and screaming into the now. And that's what black metal is trying to do as well. And that, I think, is why. But you got a link here. Fascism and black metal also have this interest in the obscure and the occult. They are interested in something that is older than Christianity, something older than normativity.
Sorry, go on.
And that's why I think they both have this terrible yet mystical allure that draws people to them, because it's hard not to be impressed by all this iconography, by something that seems so capital G great and capital P powerful. But I'm a materialist, and my thought is you should actually point at the scrawny, rat-faced looking men that make this stuff, and you will see it for what it really is, which is a terrible screeching out of the world, an attempt to reconcile their absolute hatred and misanthropy with an uncaring world.
It's so interesting. It feels like there's perhaps two ways to do a death cult. One of them is by wearing leather jackets and having skulls and crossbones and blowing up half of the world, or blowing up someone's eardrums, which is the interesting connection between the Nazis and black metal. And then on the other hand, you have the death cult as something more refined, or rather less following that specific aesthetic. And I'm talking about the mechanics of this world and the philosophers of this world. It feels like from different sides, one perhaps from the geopolitical side, another from the musical side, the black metal, and other people from philosophy and other people from psychedelics, they're kind of converging around this center point that might be called death. It's kind of the limit event or something like that.
I think we're always going to be attracted to this. It's the ultimate negation. It's the in many ways it's the biggest transgression that a human body can commit, is going from life to death. And metal is completely fascinated with not just death. Death, I think, underpins it all, but metal is interested in extremities and transgressions of all kinds. But death stands atop them all. Nothing in the human experience can transgress like not being. And that's what pulls it all to this one point.
Interesting.
But I think that I say that there are multiple perspectives in metal around death, and some of them are more. You have the black metal approach, which is more nihilistic, and then you have the doom. Then you have people who are people who like stoner metal, for instance. That I would say tends more towards absurdism, and there we can see the kind of existentialist spectrum fully played out.
Which, now I'm coming back to my initial question though about this: will metal become something utopian, as a word? Like, can this dialectical shift be completed from just negation and into death?
Right.
Because I think, we clearly see the formation of community around this aesthetics of death. And, it's fucking powerful. But
the question is, where can we go from here? Because at the moment,
the question is, does it need to go anywhere, right? Is it comfortable in being a kind of, I sometimes use the phrase, we're talking with Daniel, spiritual paracetamol, as something that is like it's a painkiller for some of the worst excesses of neoliberal capitalism.
Sure.
Without being the unworking of the thing itself. And normally I use that critique with regards to a lot of the New Age movement, some of the psychedelic movement, people who like to go and sit in Vipassana centers and stare at the wall for 10 days.
Right.
And I guess something I'm trying to figure out is, where does metal fit in here?
Right, because when people do metal, when you go and interact as a metal fan, a lot of what you're going to be doing is sitting on an outdoor table in a pub drinking and smoking, which isn't from the face of it productive labor. So that might be something that we kind of have to arrest ourselves in. Although we're very critical of a lot of the things that neoliberalism has created, although we're very critical of various oppressions all over the world, although we're critical of actions that have, individual people's actions all over the world, we're still, as I say, we're still part of the spectacle, we're still part of consumer culture. So how do we elude this? My proposal is that metal's kind of insistent straining at these boundaries, this wanting to push past the normative values, wanting to push past normative social structures. We are now at a tipping point for metal, where it has gone through a process of emergence and development and full reification, and now it is a reified cultural thing. Like 30 years ago, I would not have been able to get a job with the hair length that I have, the piercing that I have in my nose, and my preferred t-shirts. I would not have been able to get employed in a white-collar job at all. But I, until recently, was working in marketing, doing exactly that. That was last year. We've come a very, very long way. And what we've seen is a culture that has remained incredibly coherent, whereas other cultures have diversified, become slightly more co-opted. In the case of punk, or have just faded away. Metal has retained its coherence for such a long time, and and the critiques have become more substantial as well in this time. As you know, the way to think about it, it's like Bitcoin mining in a way. You can only have one person to write the first song about the Charge of the Light Brigade, and that happened to be Iron Maiden. There can only be one band that does the Trooper. There can only be one band that does an epic song called Master of Puppets about cocaine abuse. Once that piece of information is there, we have to do more. We have to go and find new combinations, and as metal has diversified and as the internet has allowed a huge multiplicity of bands to produce and distribute their music, we've now started to fill in so many of the gaps that we're starting to get like a developed theoretical critique. Once you start reading across all the bands, and especially once you speak to these musicians as well, they've got developed critiques all of their own. So I think we're beginning to get to the point where metal can actively start defining itself as a social group that has a project. And that project, to my mind, would be best evinced as a very radical leftist project that seeks to pretty much overturn all of the normative social hierarchies and replace them with oddly enough, my preferred economic system, which is anarcho-communism. I wonder why I think that metal should do the thing that I would like it to do. I wonder why.
Hey, let me ask you something. The consistency of metal culture across a variety of different bands and places in time. I mean, it's decentralized. However, it is also consistent culturally.
Yes. Yes.
What do you think that is due to?
I think it's codification. There was a time where if you were in a heavy metal band, you didn't have to wear black, and that era stops right when Judas Priest get into their kind of mid-70s career. As soon as Rob Halford develops the full-on denim and leather aesthetic, it just clicks like that. And suddenly everybody's doing it. By the time the new wave of British heavy metal starts to emerge in the late 70s, Saxon literally put out a track called Denim and Leather. Like that aesthetic becomes very, very cemented, which supplants a sort of a semi-glam, semi-psychedelic, semi-gothic aesthetic that bands like Black Sabbath had been pushing around before. I think the reason that the codes are so well entrenched is because it allows you to radically demarcate yourself as other. Yeah, by establishing a code that seems very and also it speaks to power, and power is something that metal also to an extent fetishizes. Not I think in the same way that it fetishizes death, though obviously we need to look at the symbolism of black and the importance of the importance of wearing like hard-wearing working class type materials like denim and leather. That also has to be considered. Though on the other hand, you also have to point out the fact that Rob Halford imported leather culture from homosexuality, from homosexual BDSM culture and leather culture, and he pulled it straight into metal pretty much with nobody noticing at the time for its origins, and this was able to basically outgrow itself and become this very, very defined aesthetic. I think there's some people have said people like metal because they like there's a collector's aspect to it, where you can have, it's not just you wear a band t-shirt, you have as many band t-shirts as you can possibly have. You have a jacket that's got the patches on it as well, and you can infinitely customize. But in doing so, each step, again, demarcates yourself away from normativity. It offers a code that easily makes you recognizable to other metalheads, but is basically inscrutable to a passerby. And that's what all subcultures do. You can go back and look at the way the mods or punks do this in the same way. Like you're using your clothing, you're using your style to indicate to the in-group, your in-group, who you are, and to indicate to all other groups that you are not like them. So that's a very important kind of social function, I think, that arises out of that. Symbolically, I think wearing all black makes me feel personally like I'm a hole in the world, and I think I'm just attracted to negation in that aspect. That if people were quizzed but for long enough in the same way, we might get similar conclusions. Again, I would have to speak to them.
It feels like that a lot of the here's my thinking. A lot of what has happened in since 45, from 45 onwards, has had a lot to do with the negation of previous norms. As you said, there's been this process as postmodernism developed, as capitalism developed, as technology developed, this process of freeing things, freeing love from the normativity that was imposed on it previously, freeing individual rebellion and giving it sort of a placeholder and sort of a vessel on which it can subsist. And I can't help but to think of Aleister Crowley, especially him, namely him, as maybe not the only figure, but one of the key and most noticeable figures in the beginning of this process of negation, because so much of what he was all about, and his experiments and his writings and all that, they were kind of a personal experimentation on negation, on the destruction of norms. And maybe that's why I'm insisting on this idea of there being a spirit to metal. Rather, I know you're a materialist, but and maybe I'll discuss the way these metaphysics of these spirits hypostasize into reality in a way that isn't really contentious. But my whole point being that process, which was started previously perhaps by Crowley, finds itself feeding into metal. I mean, Black Sabbath have a song called
exactly.
Crowley.
Ozzy
you even have you even have these, Ozzy Osbourne, and you have also these characters like Jimmy Page, like circling around these topics so very much. Again, the shamanic, the transcendental, but it is a shamanic and a transcendental. That's not about, sometimes it's neo-pagan. It's about neo-folk, neo-volkism, as you can see in Scandinavia. Yep. Sometimes it's about pure adversarialism.
Yes, sure. I think metal, I've mentioned before, metal kind of fits into the sort of secret histories, the kind of history of radical ideas and radical art movements that kind of persists all the way through certainly can be found persisting all the way through the 20th century. So it is part of this secret history, but as I said before, metal is very much a postmodern musicking. We're completely defined, in fact, by postmodernity, because metal doesn't have any corollaries outside of the postmodern era. It's entirely contained within the post-45 mode.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this means that we're aware of the fact that meaning has been, compromised, or God is dead. We're fully aware of that when metal starts to happen, but we're still fascinated with these arcane symbols. We're still interested in spirituality. We're still interested in trying to find this deeper meaning. So there's a lot of self-mythologizing that goes on in metal. And this is the thing that I wanted to talk about from Tony Iommi that we mentioned earlier. Tony Iommi famously had the tops of his fingertips sliced off in a metal factory in Birmingham, and that caused him to detune his guitar, and it also caused him to put on these fake fingertips that that made a different sound to the sound that real fingers would have made on a guitar. And people use this as a way of saying that metal, the substance, is deeply bound into metal, the music, and that is an incredibly appealing idea. You should also look at, there are some very odd things about the way that metal is able to self-mythologize. Like, for instance, the most famous metal band in the world is called Metallica. They're literally called Metallica. It's in the name. Or the fact that the first Black Sabbath song on the first Black Sabbath album, called Black Sabbath, starts with a funeral bell and then immediately leads us into a tritone, which is the devil's interval. It's the first metal song, and we're immediately being defined by the tritone. That's almost eerie how synchronous it is, right?
Fucking fascinating.
Now I'm interested in synchronicity. I think it's fun and very cool when you observe it, but I think metal has a massive tendency to try and develop a mythic aura around itself, precisely because it's aware of the loss of meaning going on in the world around it. But in our world, we can try and make meaning. We can really work on the process of developing meaning. We can write lyrics that are so bloody obscure that you have to read them in order to understand them, because not only are the words being, pronounced gutturally so that you can't hear them properly, but even if they were just being spoken, you need a thesaurus to understand it. That's very death metal.
Are you familiar with the work of René Girard?
Not properly, no, though I know the name.
So he gives an interesting way to resolve the conundrum of spirituality and God and luminosity within what I would say is a materialist framework, in that so the basis of his theory, the mimetic theory is what it's called, is this idea that humans, we tend to copy each other, and we tend to desire in a way that copies one another, which inevitably leads to conflict, because in a situation, a small society, let's say there's like a certain number of water bottles and I want a water bottle, which means you guys end up wanting water bottles, and once we start running out of water bottles, there's competition for the resources, but then we start copying each other in competing each other as well. And so we just end up escalating conflict. And the conflict is ostensibly about a water bottle, but really it's about the fact that you're pissed at me and I'm pissed at you, and neither of us really wants to back down.
Yeah.
And this can lead to a situation of escalating violence and all against all. And the way that primitive societies learned to resolve that was through finding a scapegoat, a figure onto which to project all of the social disorder and turbulence. And we say, that is what is fucking us up. If we just get rid of it, then order will be reestablished. And he reckons it worked. And that was the genesis of the idea of the sacred. Some kind of object, some kind of figure that has this power to reunite the warring factions of the community. And for that reason, it's sacralized. But the flip side of that is that it is also the thing that all of the disharmony and the evil was projected onto. And so there is this double fascination around this figure of the scapegoat, with it being transcendent and unifying, but also profane and disgusting and dark.
Yeah. And perhaps metal is able to achieve synthesis there. I would point out that metal loves the profane, absolutely is fascinated with the profane, but uses the profane in order to shore ourselves up, to develop barriers against a tough outside world that is difficult to navigate. Where hip hop sees a neoliberal society and says the only way is up, I've got to navigate my way through this to get out. Metal sees the world and says, I have no intention of ever engaging with this. It's a rejection, less an integration or a willingness to engage in that system of competition. So I think it has the potential to be transcendent in its profanity. I think when metal musicians and metal fans talk about the way they engage with profanity, a lot of the time it's done with a sense of humor. There's a lot of comedy to be had in the disgusting, in the lurid, and that too binds us together. But it is through this examination of themes that normative society does not want to discuss, often explicitly. You don't want to talk about death in polite company. You don't want to talk about massive capitalist oppression. You don't want to talk about foreign wars. You don't want to talk about Agent Orange. You don't want to talk about cancer. These are things that cannot broach the polite society that metal so despises. I think it is important as well I briefly want to touch on metal's class character while we're here, because although hip-hop, as I say, hip-hop looks to navigate up, and I think that arises from its particularly working class position. If you have enough resources to have a guitar and an amp and a bedroom where you are in relative comfort and you can while away writing riffs, you don't have to go out and sell anything. You don't have to go out and sling crack on the streets, because you have enough money at the very least to have an amp and a bedroom. People in hip hop, that were living in the projects in the 80s, didn't have that. They had a boom box that they could play tapes on and toast over. That's a completely different set of material circumstances. And so metal, over its 50-year plus lifespan, has gone from something that started as very, very working class to something that now has less of a class character. You find metal fans from across the socio-political spectrum, the socioeconomic spectrum. You find very, very working class metal fans, and you find people like myself who were raised in relative comfort. What you don't find nearly ever is metal fans in the bourgeoisie proper. In the petty bourgeoisie, sure. Not in the actual ruling classes. That, I believe, would not make much sense. But yeah, it's just important to note that metal kind of has gained this sort of middle class reputation, but I think that it has the potential to kind of get past this if it needs to, and often it does get past this. But nonetheless, it's something that we should be aware of in the scene, and it's something that I kind of turn over a lot, especially as I said, as myself coming from middle class background and engaging in a culture that totally fetishizes working class fashion stereotypes and behaviors. Like, if I'd cleaved to the normative paths that were set before me during my childhood, I wouldn't be a smoker. I certainly wouldn't smoke cannabis. These are things that alternative culture, in represented by metal in this case, pulls you towards.
Let me throw a theory at you. That's something I'm still kind of working through in my head, and so it'd be interesting to critique it and pull it apart. But I guess you could sum it up with this idea that the band itself is a product of individualist culture. The way a band performs, there are a few people who are supremely talented at their instrument, and within the performance, the focus is directed towards the stage. Everyone's looking at the few performers. There's a kind of unidirectionality towards it. They play out, and the audience looks up, and can at times create these kind of cults of personality around bands or indeed band members. What I see in in some aspects of underground dance music culture, not everywhere, but say certain aspects of the techno scene, as I sense a slight moving away from the individualism that is projected onto the performer, which is not always the case. Like the cult of the DJ is still very much a thing. Yeah, but I think in a lot of clubs, you get a vibe where it's very dark. The audience isn't really focusing on the stage, if there is even a stage. The directionality of the audience is much more fluid. People dance in different circles and different directions, and there's also the remix component of the music itself, rather than DJs necessarily playing their songs that the audience will know. The DJ stitches together a flow of many other musical forms and sounds that is totally spontaneous and improvised, and that triggers a kind of spontaneous improvisation in the crowd. My theory is that this is kind of moving away from the individualism and bringing us closer to a kind of music of Deleuzian individualism, where it's less about focus and people and flows and movements.
Yes, sure. Now, when you go to a metal concert, it's not like going to a dance concert in terms of the number of people who are there that are themselves musicians. This is something that I think is very important in metal. It has a disproportionately high number of fans who are also producers in the scene in some way. If you might be... Nearly everyone that I know that likes metal plays guitar or sings or plays drums. And then if you're not musical, you might be a graphic artist, you might be a producer, you might be a promoter, you might be doing any number of other things along the way. You might work for a label, you might run a podcast, but everyone in the metal scene engages very directly with with the scene. They make the scene. In a way that's not really seen in a lot of other genres. Now, this is kind of because certainly when I'm talking about metal, in a lot of cases, I'm talking about specifically extreme metal. I almost don't count bands like Iron Maiden or Slipknot as metal in the same way that an underground band is. They've been corrupted. You know, they've had decades of big label money thrown at them. It doesn't. They live in a world that is so far removed. But I completely see your point about the kind of lionization of individual musicians. I would point out that there are quite a lot of bands now that where the musicians have alternate identities. The use of corpse paint, or in the case of bands like Sun, the use of grim robes to disguise your identity on stage, to kind of detract away from the individualization of the musician and put more emphasis just on, certainly in Sun's case, literally just the intensity, Deleuzian intensity of sound, pure power, pulsing through your body, making you a complete object for but a moment.
Because it's so peculiar, like with techno, it's anonymous, it's dark, you are a cognitive machine, it's a flow where identity gets dissolved, the individual disappears, maybe, and that's why, you know, art and subcultures have this gift of being able to see the future. However, the rituals inherent in perhaps the metal concert are quite different. You have a few priests who deliver a ceremony for other people who are also perhaps gifted in the craft and understand what's happening there. So they're maybe perhaps more in tune with, you know, the tritone that he just played or the double drum fill, whatever.
It's like a magic circle. It's like a magic circle, basically. Because my point being that the average fan, the average concert goer, is going to be able to look up at the stage and not just see. If you go to a rock concert, you're a fan, you look far, far up, because the stages are very high. You go to an arena concert, those stages are a long way away. You look up for 5 meters or more. You see that man, there's a big fat spotlight behind him. You lionize that man. You go to a metal gig, an underground metal gig, 200 cap venue. They are standing maybe a foot above you, if that. You can look the musicians dead in the eye and think, next week, I'm actually going to be on that stage. which you cannot do in nearly every other scene, apart from punk. Punk also kind of has that vibe to an extent, but punk, without wanting to sound too harsh, is a lame duck at this point. Metal is the one to bet on. But the people in the crowd are themselves creators. So this is a circle of shamans. We are all gathering to engage in some kind of invocation, and although it looks like we're trying to get to some kind of arcane past or drag this arcane past back into the now, I think I'd say we are postmodern cultural practitioners. We're taking the whole of the sum of the parts. We're taking nearly all of culture and redistilling it into powerful new statements that, in the best examples, are leading us forward and are showing us the ways that we can actually go back out into the world and redevelop it.
It's very much a craft of the, when you were talking about everyone in the audience having this musical ability. It's like there's a big aspect of a craft that everyone kind of gets initiated into, as opposed to the passive absorption or consumption that we find in other subgenres, and that's very interesting.
Sure. Yeah, no. So I mean, you can look at any number of things to sort of see that sort of cultic initiation. I mean, like anything from growing the hair, buying the jacket, buying, etc. Having to explain to your friends and co-workers why you're wearing the stuff that you're wearing, having to explain to them what a blast beat is, knowing full well that they neither care nor understand. It is like craft. It is like witchcraft or shamanic practice in that respect. But I think it's shamanism for late capitalism.
Yeah.
And now I say we're at the point where the shamanic tribe can start to fully push away and even start to get back to the point where we can influence the world, because the people that were making the first waves of grindcore back in the late 80s, this incredibly politicized metal, those people are now in their 50s. These people are now the listeners of that time. They're now middle managers, borderline senior managers. With every generation over, we see these very, very abrupt cultural shifts. It happens almost every 20 years. You get a generation of people that have grown up with a certain social normativity being kind of dissolved, and then they get there and they're able to finally kind of sign it away. Metal has had 2 generations, as it were, to entrench itself, and I think now that to self-mythologize, the very fact that I'm at the point where I'm considering that metal is a social bloc should be sign enough that metal is becoming a social bloc.
Truth is
that is somewhat circular reasoning, but on the other hand, that is what has kind of propelled metal all this time, is this knowing there is very little inherent meaning around the world in the world around us. So the only thing we can do is shore what little of it we have up and try and make it blossom into something that transcends its parts. Something in the music that gets beyond just the fact that you're playing a guitar. There's something unearthly, the heaviness, the density. Intensity. You mentioned Deleuze earlier. I've been puzzling over Deleuze's kind of take on intensity. It fits so well for metal because he defines intensity as difference, and that's perfect already because metal is all about radical differences. But also when he talks about aesthetic intensity, he talks about how good art should be this tour of sensations, drawing you from one intensity to another, contrasts. are this beautiful fruit that emerge from radical differences all stacked up against each other, constant breaking and reintegrating of flows. And metal is all about that, all about intensity in both those senses.
And it's not afraid to shy away from, or rather, yeah, it doesn't shy away from aggression, pain, death, as we've already said, which are,
it revels in them.
Ideas that have been common to pretty much all religious systems until we get to the religion of enlightenment, rationality, and modernity. And then we just kind of sweep all that shit under the carpet and go, yeah, that shit doesn't really exist. And if it does exist, then it's a personal pathology, and you can go to a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst for it, or you can consume to get rid of it. And everything, all pain is expressed at the level of the individual and born at the level of the individual, rather than being seen as a cultural phenomenon that has its own aesthetic and its own spirits that are connected to it, whether you understand spirits in a kind of mystical animist way or in a more kind of postmodern,
big alien sense.
Exactly.
Just in the sense of zeitgeist. I mean, that I'm not against spirituality in any sense, but when I look out at the world, I'm amazed enough by the way material constructs form geists of their own, as it were. You can see the qualia around things.
Such a good point.
You can apprehend the metadata, and for me, that's a kind of materialist spirituality.
Fair enough. That's such an interesting point. It reminds me of the idea of the machinic phylum of Delanda, where it says that technologies produce descendants and have lineages. And you spoke of the guy who chopped his own fingers and he wanted to play the guitar. So that sort of self-mythologizing event that occurs in that time of history and the core of the postmodern era has its antecedents in the form of industrial society.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. In Blake's Dark Satanic Mills.
In Crowley's Magic, and maybe what I'm sort of trying to get at is that these things end up, Black Sabbath and occultism profoundly. There's deep connections in there in the Pact of Faust. Which is in a way so connected to the mythos of metal. And it feels like as we approach the digital age and leave the sort of, from 45 to 2000 more analog, but yet already industrialized age, feels like the emergences that might become possible, they're very interesting. I mean, in the same way that Metallica and metal and this very interesting anecdote of the guy chopping off his own fingers at the mill in Brighton, at the factory. Like, what's the analog of that as we move towards the digital age? Where do you see the lust and the spirits of metal now that we've outsourced the dreamscape is out there and we live in it?
I'll point to two musical examples for this. One of the most interesting bands to come out of the last decade that are incredibly heavy but not metal are Death Grips. In Death Grips, the industrial hip-hop band, I see they've been able to take heaviness and they've been able to take this fascination with the arcane, and they've put it right back into hip-hop in this very new way that it manages to capture all of that rage and that power, but it is so much bound to the terms of the internet and the discourses of the internet that it's inextricably linked. So that's one example of the way that metal has been able to kind of provide its own musical elements to other genres. It's become something that's identifiable. Heaviness is now something that people can see. The other thing, the other example I wanted to point to is Death Heaven, who are they're a major exponent of what's called black gaze, which is black metal plus shoegaze. And what we've seen there is the radical transformation of black metal from a culture that's obsessed with the rural past, or a borderline like feudal or Norse past, to something that can completely handle the present moment and industrialized surroundings, and is able instead to look at the city as the forest that Norwegian black metal bands would have considered. You know, they're looking to the wastelands, they're looking to the forests to inspire their metaphors. They're talking about nature, they're talking about having their hands bitten off by frostbite all the time. Death Heaven look at New York and see the skyscrapers as the forest. This is the jungle that we have to walk within now. And we still feel this like radical absolutist pain and suffering that runs through all of black metal. But we're able to link it back to this hyper-modern, hyper-connected, sensationalist world that we live in now. So I think as we step into the 2020s, metal is still evolving. We've covered so much, and to an extent, lots of the major genres have become saturated almost, because you can find 25 stoner bands that all play the same kind of riff and have the same kind of tone. It's very easy to do. But I don't think that we're done by any means. I think in across the next decades, we're going to see even more collaboration with hip hop and electronic into metal. Metal's going to become something that is unmoored from other musical cultures, and it'll be a musical world in the same way that jazz or classical is. A whole musical world with an entire musical vocabulary that other genres pull on just as much as we pull on them, and that I think demonstrates just how adaptable and how kind of flexible the form is.
I have one final question, Owen, if you allow me. Who has, in your view, taken the testimony of metal's aggression and anti-normativity, musical or otherwise, as a movement?
Which one person best exemplified this?
Not even, could be a person, could be a movement, could be a musical act, could be whatever you come up with.
You are asking me what is the most metal, is what you're asking.
Exactly.
What is the most metal? Well, that changes all the time, because sometimes I'll read a news story and go, that's pretty fucking metal. And then sometimes I'll drop a juice carton on the floor, or I'll drop my glass and I'll go, God damn, that was pretty metal. The thing that is most metal, I couldn't begin to answer that. There are things that are incredibly metal in every experience, in every object. Every object is partial, as Deleuze would have it, and therefore, because all objects are partial, all objects contain bits of other objects, all objects have metal in them somewhere, the kind of conceptual metal, the heaviness, that thing.
Heaviness.
That thing that is the gut punch when you hear the riff, that thing that when you see a terrible event happen, you go, oh, fuck. It's that visceral reaction, that is in everything, and it is up to us as metal wizards to go and locate it. So I don't know.
Bit the head off a bat. That was one thing.
That's very...
Chinese guy comes along and eats a fucking bat and gives the world a pandemic.
Right, that's way more metal. That's so metal. Do you know how metal that is? That guy's demos aren't even released. At least Ozzy Osbourne got out on a major. This guy never even made demos, and he's known throughout the world, man. That's heavy as fuck.
Yeah, man.
All right,
guys, I think we need to leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much,
David. That was fucking awesome, man. We should talk again.
Man.
I'd love to come back if you guys want to. Can I quickly plug?
Yeah, go ahead.
You can find my academia by searching my name, David Burke, Academia. I've got several articles on there. I also write for a zine called Astral Noise, and hopefully in a couple of months I should be starting a doctorate going over attempting to uncover the metal ideology. And once I start doing that, I should be starting to create my own video and audio content as well. I should start making a podcast and that kind of thing too.
Yeah, man. I think you should have a podcast. I think you could have a really cool podcast.
Yeah, it's been something I've been floating around for a while, but yeah, thank you so much for this, guys. This is the first one I've been on. I really enjoyed it. Great to catch up with you, Owen, as well. Long time no see. We should do something sometime.
Yeah, for sure, brother. All right.
Cool. Thank you very much. Peace, guys. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.